What do a foam-covered horse, a piece of candy, and a revolver have in common? You're about to find out on this episode of Forgotten Felonies.
Welcome back to Forgotten Felonies. I'm Monica.
And I'm Olivia.
And this is where we take you back in time to rediscover the tales of vintage villainy that time forgot. This case has truly been forgotten. I did find one blog entry by a woman who travels around to visit the graves of people who died terrible deaths, and she had an entry about this case, but I have seen nothing else on the internet aside from that. This case is from Indiana, and it overlaps two different counties, Grant County and Tipton County. And with that said, let's walk back in time to October 25th, 1903. A horse covered in foam pulled into the city of Marion after being driven hard for miles, its sides heaving with every breath. But the man in the buggy didn't go straight to the jail. Instead, he stopped first at a livery stable on 40th Street, Smith's Livery Barn, where he turned over the horse and calmly asked that it be fed. From there, he went into town and sat down at a restaurant, identified in the papers as the Club Restaurant, and he ordered himself a meal. And this is one of those moments that just sticks with you, because while he sat there eating, he was crying, not causing a scene, not drawing attention, just quietly crying to himself. At one point, a clerk or waitress noticed and asked him what was wrong, and he told her very plainly that he had just done something he would hang for. Then he finished his meal, and only after that did he make his way to the jail. When he arrived at the Grant County Jail in Marion, he asked to see the turnkey. The officer on duty, Charles Jones, came to the door, and the man introduced himself as Thomas Jesse McClure. And then, just as plainly as before, he confessed. He told them that he had just killed his two little boys. At first, they didn't know what to make of it. It was such a shocking claim delivered so calmly that there was some question as to whether it could even be true. But McClure gave details, locations, names, exactly where the children could be found, and as he spoke, the weight of it began to settle in. Sheriff Mills was notified, and he immediately began making calls, reaching out to Elwood and to the area near Point Isabel. One by one, those calls confirmed the worst. The children had been found exactly where McClure said they would be, shot in their heads, left along the roadside. Inside the jail, McClure handed over his revolver and cartridges, placing them carefully into the officer's hands. And then he made one strange request. He asked that the empty shells not be removed from the gun. He wanted it left exactly as it was, just as it had been when his children were killed. By that point, word was already beginning to spread, and the sheriff understood something immediately. If people in the surrounding area found out where McClure was being held, there would be no containing it. A mob would come, and when they did, they would not be looking for a trial. So within half an hour, arrangements were made to move him out of Marion. Under guard, he was taken from the jail, rushed to an interurban line, and transported to Indianapolis, where the jail was stronger and more secure, and far more capable of withstanding what they believed was coming. Because this was no ordinary crime, and the people who heard about it were not likely to let it go quietly. To understand how we got here, we have to go back a few years before the crime, before the headlines, before Thomas Jesse McClure ever walked into that jail and confessed. Because this story doesn't start with Jesse, it starts with Sarah.
Sarah Ellen Kilgore was born November 25th, 1875 in Tipton County, Indiana. She was the daughter of Joseph H. Kilgore and Huldah Purty. She was the second of 9 children.
Sarah Ellen Kilgore was first married to a man named Robert F. Reel. The two were married in March of 1894, and for a time they lived what appeared, at least from the outside, to be a fairly ordinary life. They had a daughter together, Veda Olive Reel, born on February 9th, 1898, and they settled into the rhythms of rural Indiana. But by the end of 1898, that marriage had completely fallen apart. Sarah filed for divorce in November of that year, citing cruelty. And while that alone isn't unusual for the time period, what is unusual is what was happening inside their home at the same time. Because for a year or two leading up to that divorce, another man had been living with them. His name was Thomas Jesse McClure.
Thomas Jesse McClure was born in Allen Township, Miami, Indiana, in June of 1860. From the research I found, it seems that he was the son of David McClure and Elizabeth Mary Ann Williams. He had 3 siblings, though the older 2 died fairly young, so only he and his younger brother lived into adulthood.
Jesse was boarding with the Real family, working in the area and living under their roof, and according to multiple accounts, it was the affections he paid to Sarah that led to the destruction of not just one marriage, but 2. Because Jesse wasn't just involved in Sarah's life, he was also married himself. In fact, by the time he entered the Real household, Jesse already had a long and complicated marital history. Years earlier, in July of 1883, he had married a woman named Clara Johnson, and the 2 had a young son together. Baby William was born in 1884, and he died in 1887 at the age of 3.5. The marriage ended in divorce at some point, but I don't know if it was before or after the death of little William. Clara herself remarried in 1887, and then she passed away about 3 years later. Jesse would go on to marry again as well in August of 1887. His second wife, Maria C. Ness, also divorced him. They had 1 child together, born in 1888, and then that child died in 1895. But by January of 1899, that marriage too had come to an end, just 4 years after their child's death. So by the time Jesse was living in the Real home, forming a relationship with Sarah, this wasn't new territory for him. This was a bit of a pattern. Relationships that began intensely, deteriorated somewhat quickly, and ended in separation. And this time the consequences would be even more far-reaching, because while Sarah was trying to legally end her marriage to Robert Real, and Jesse was doing the same with his own wife, Maria, their own relationship was already moving forward, publicly, and in a way that would have raised more than a few eyebrows in a small Indiana community.
Sarah's initial divorce filing was dismissed and then refiled, likely due to a technical issue. But by early 1899, everything came to a head. On January 13th, 1899, Jesse's divorce from Maria was granted. The grounds of his divorce were abandonment and cruelty. He stated that Maria would often leave for the whole night and refuse to explain where she had been. She would also insult and embarrass him in front of company. This sounded valid to the judge, so he granted the divorce. On February 28, 1899, Sarah's divorce from Robert Real was finalized, and immediately, the same afternoon, she married Thomas Jesse McClure. The paper stated that she had an infant on her arm while they signed the paperwork. This was Veda Olive Real, who had just turned a year old about 3 weeks earlier.
And what's funny is that Jesse, who had his own divorce granted 6 weeks earlier, had been ordered by the court not to remarry for 2 years. But since nobody made a fuss over this marriage, the judge just shrugged it off.
At the time they got married on February 28, 1899, their family was already growing. According to the 1900 census, a child named James E. McClure was already a year old at that time, born in May of 1899, which means that by the time Sarah and Jesse stood in front of the judge and were married, that child had already been conceived. On April 19th of 1900, 11 months after James was born, another son was born, recorded in Jesse's own Bible as James Omer McClure, but referred to in the newspapers as Omer, or more commonly, Homer. And about 11 months after Omer was born, on March 8th of 1901, a third boy followed, Richard, who was called D. Unfortunately, the firstborn son, James, must have died in early childhood because in 1903, he isn't mentioned even once. His entry on Family Search just says deceased and doesn't give an actual date, so we don't know exactly when he died.
There is literally no mention in the papers of their son James or even a scandal of pregnancy at the wedding. The wedding was February 28th of 1899, so Sarah would have been about 6 months pregnant with James during the wedding if he was, in fact, born in May of 1899.
That explains the simultaneous divorces and the immediate remarriage.
Yes, it does. Now, what's clear is that by the year 1903, Sarah and Jesse had built a household with young children. Her daughter Veda from a previous marriage, and then by that time they had just the 2 little boys who, at least for a time, were the center of their world. From the very beginning, this relationship moved quickly. It crossed boundaries and it formed under circumstances that were anything but stable. And just as quickly as it came together, it would begin to come apart. Now, if the beginning of their relationship was unstable, what followed only made things worse. After their marriage, Jesse and Sarah didn't settle into one place for long. Instead, they moved again and again across central Indiana. Point Isabel, Marion, back to Point Isabel, then Elwood, a farm near Elwood, Dundee, Alexandria, and finally Frankton. It wasn't just a couple of moves, it was constant, a pattern of never quite staying, never quite settling, and always starting over somewhere new.
Whoa, that's 7 moves after their first home in Point Isabel. That's very frequent considering they were married at the end of February of 1899 and split up in early October of 1903. That's 7 moves in about 4.5 years.
That is. And they're moving with multiple very young children. That is something I would not want to sign up for, honestly. That would be rough. Anyway, coming from a forensic psych perspective, a high level of family transiency like this is one risk factor for the perpetration of violence. Just FYI. Now, wherever they went, the same problems seemed to follow. By multiple accounts, Jesse was a hard worker when he was sober, but he drank. Often and heavily, and when he did, his behavior changed. The newspapers say that he began drinking at the age of 19, and he would go on benders that would last anywhere from 3 to 4 days to 3 to 4 weeks, and he would disappear during these times, like literally abandon his family. He would leave his wife and kids destitute until he returned, so they had to rely on the charity of neighbors just to have enough food to eat. People who knew him well described him as very pleasant and very put together when he was sober, but otherwise he was quarrelsome, unpredictable, and increasingly volatile. And over time, that volatility turned into something more serious. This was not a peaceful household. It was a household where the patriarch was angry and unhinged. Arguments escalated, and for Sarah, these arguments were unwinnable. She was accused of being a woman of loose morals.
I mean, to be fair, she and Jesse were both married to other people when they got together.
Very true, and also happening in the house that she shared with her husband. So, yeah. His morals weren't any better than hers. In that home, Sarah and the children were not safe. There were repeated threats, very serious threats. Jesse threatened to kill Sarah all the time. He was very physically violent and didn't care about anyone else when he was drunk. In fact, Sarah later said that 2 days before their first son was born, Jesse had knocked her down with a chair and kicked her. He was very physically abusive to the children as well, and Sarah would often put herself between Jesse and the kids, knowing that the violence would just be turned on her instead. Eventually, it became too much. On October 6th of 1903, after another violent incident at their home in Frankfort, Indiana, Sarah made a decision. She filed an affidavit accusing Jesse of assault and battery, and she also sought something called a surety of the peace. That was essentially a request for the court to require Jesse to post a bond, a financial guarantee, that he would not harm her. And if he refused, he could be held in jail. Sarah specified she wanted the bond to be $500.
That has the purchasing power of about $18,500 in our 2026 United States currency.
That is a lot. I doubt they had that kind of money, honestly. But Jesse was put in jail in Anderson, Indiana for that assault charge, and the police didn't take any steps at all on that surety of the peace request. Sarah didn't just file the paperwork and walk away, though. She pushed. She returned to the authorities 3 times over the next couple weeks, insisting that he was very dangerous, that if he were released, he would try to kill her and her 5.5-year-old daughter, Veda, which he was attempting to do when she made the decision that she had had enough. She was asking the police very clearly to take that extra step, to put something in place that might keep her and the kids safe. But they didn't do it. Sarah decided to take the kids, Veda, 3-year-old Omer, and 2-year-old Dee, to her father's house in Point Isabel, Indiana. When Jesse was released from jail, he didn't disappear. He stayed nearby, moving between Elwood and Frankton, drinking heavily, and thinking about his boys. The longer he was away from them, the more angry he became. And it wasn't just anger, it was an inebriated obsession. As the days went on, that fixation seemed to grow. He was not letting this go, not the separation, not the children, and certainly not Sarah. Because in his mind, this wasn't over. In his mind, Sarah was out gallivanting across the countryside with every man who wanted her. He just knew she'd be dragging the kids around with her while she made those immoral choices, and the poor children would be helpless.
Maple Flake, the nation's favorite. When an article achieves such widespread approval as Maple Flake enjoys, there must be a reason. From Maine to California, people know Maple Flake as the best strength-building, body and brain-bracing food that can be had. Great crisp flakes of wheat, delicately flavored with pure maple syrup and toasted to a delicious brown. Thoroughly cooked. Ready to eat, 15 cents at your grocer's.
On October 23rd, Sarah took the children and went to stay with her sister Maggie, who was married to Robert Hall. They lived 4 miles west and 1 mile south of Sarah's father.
Sarah's father lived in Point Isabel, which is located in Grant County. If you head west from there for about 2 miles, you'll reach the border of Tipton County. So, Maggie Hall's house was just 2 miles over that county border.
And then, on Saturday, October 24th, something within Jesse McClure shifted. He had somehow heard that Sarah had taken the children from her father's house and gone to stay with her sister. And for some reason, whether it was true or not, he became fixated on one specific detail, that she had made the boys walk the entire distance. A 2-year-old and a 3-year-old walking 5 miles over rough country roads, and he could not let it go. He thought about it while he worked that whole day on the 24th. He was working at Newkirk Brothers outside of Elwood, and he thought about it through the afternoon, and by that evening, it had taken hold of him completely. He'd also been drinking heavily all day, so that didn't help. Later, he would say that he couldn't sleep that night, that the thought of his children walking those miles stayed with him until he felt like he had to do something. So that night, he hitched a ride into Elwood. He made his way to a livery stable, also owned by a Mr. Newkirk, and arranged for a horse and buggy to be ready for him the following morning. He would be there at 6:00 a.m. to pick it up, he said. And then he found a lodging house where he stayed for the night. The next morning, Sunday, October 25th, 1903, he followed through exactly as planned. He picked up the horse and buggy at 6:00, just as he had arranged, and from there he went straight to a grocery store. He purchased simple things like bologna, cake, candy, and a dozen bananas. And this was food for the children. At around 6:30 that morning, he left Elwood and started down the road toward where he believed Sarah would be. It wasn't a frantic trip. It wasn't rushed. He was drinking quite heavily the whole way, and whenever he'd see someone along the way, he would offer them some of his alcohol and cigars. Now, by all accounts, he was driving at an ordinary pace, making his way through the countryside, carrying with him the things he had bought, and whatever thoughts had kept him awake the night before. His first stop was at the home of Joseph Kilgore, Sarah's father. This home was on the way to the Hall home, so he figured he'd stop and ask if Sarah was there just in case. She wasn't, so he carried on. By the time he reached the Hall home, it was just before noon. And from that moment on, everything is nerve-wracking for poor Sarah. When he arrived, Sarah saw him coming, and she didn't hesitate. She and the kids had been out in the orchard. Sarah quickly gathered up her kids and took them inside the house, afraid that her drunken husband would do them bodily harm. Now, the next part of the story is unclear because I have seen several different accounts. According to Jesse's account, he first went up and knocked on the door. Now, just for clarity, I need to remind you all that Sarah's maiden name is Kilgore. This home is owned by Robert Hall and his wife, Maggie Kilgore Hall. Sarah and Maggie are sisters, but there's another Kilgore sister visiting there as well. 16-year-old Emma Kilgore is there, and it's Emma who answers the door. Jesse says that he asked to see Sarah, and Emma told him that Sarah refused to see him. He asked again, and again she refused. Then he changed tactics. He then asked if he could at least see his boys and take them on a buggy ride. First, the answer was no, but finally Sarah said it was okay, and Emma brought the boys out to Jesse. Emma later testified that Jesse was staggering drunk. According to an article in the Journal and Courier, Sarah later testified on the stand that it happened differently. She supposedly said that she was rushing the kids from the orchard to the house, and Jesse was able to coax them over to the buggy by showing them that he had candy. So this makes it sound like Sarah and Veda got inside, and she left the boys outside, and then when she saw he was calling to the boys, she did literally nothing to go and grab them.
That sounds really weird.
It does. So I wonder if it was a mix of both. Like maybe Emma brought the boys out and they didn't want to go with Jesse, so then he coaxed them with candy. But despite everything, despite the threats and the fear, Jesse was still their father, and the boys had no idea what danger they were in. Sarah had no idea either. She later said that she thought he was going to kill her and Veda, and she hadn't even the slightest inkling that he would have killed his own boys. Now, the boys, 3-year-old Omer and 2-year-old Dee, were excited to see their papa. They climbed into the buggy and they were thrilled to go for a ride. Now, if my measurements on Google Maps are correct, the Hall home was located on what is now called County Road South 500 East. Jesse simply drove the buggy back and forth down that road, passing in front of the Hall home over and over. The horse became so accustomed to going to this specific spot and turning around that the horse started doing it without any prompting from his driver. Like, that's how many times they went back and forth and back and forth. Jesse gave the boys the food that he had bought, the candy, the cakes, and the bananas. He said they ate 11 of the bananas, actually. And for a while, it looked like nothing was wrong. He stopped more than once at the Hall house when he was going past, and he asked again for Sarah to come out and speak with him, and each time she refused. Finally, Sarah was so worried that he was going to somehow get inside and kill her and Veda that she took 5-year-old Veda in her arms and ran through a cornfield to get to the safety of a neighboring farm. Robert and Maggie Hall had actually gone to town earlier. So with Sarah and Veda now gone, running through the cornfield, that left 16-year-old Emma Kilgore alone at the Hall house. And outside, Jesse kept driving back and forth, back and forth. The boys were with him in the buggy, eating the food that he had brought. They were laughing, they were talking, and they were enjoying the ride. By his own account, they were happy. They were playing at his knees on the floor of the buggy, calling him by all the affectionate names that little children have for their fathers. And for a time, it seems like he let himself enjoy that. But underneath it, something else was building. Because this wasn't just a visit. This was a man who had spent the entire night thinking about his children. A man who had made plans, who had secured a horse and buggy, who had come prepared with food and treats, and his loaded revolver. And Jesse had already been refused again and again by the person he actually wanted to see. And every time he stopped at the house again to ask for Sarah, every time Sarah did not come out, it reinforced something in his mind. At some point, he stopped the buggy at the house for the third and final time. He wanted Sarah to come out and speak with him. He didn't know Sarah had fled, but Emma gave him a message. Sarah never wanted to see him again, ever. He told Emma very plainly that Sarah would be sorry for that. And then, finally, he drove away. Not far, not in a panic, just away from the house. Down the road, past the familiar turning point, beyond where the horse had been stopping and circling back on its own. It was a bend in the road, shrouded by a cluster of trees on the edge of a field. This time, he didn't turn around. It was quiet there. It was isolated and out of view of anyone who could possibly have been watching. And by this point, the boys had grown tired and had fallen asleep. Jesse later said that he had been so happy and he looked at the boys and thought this was the best time of his life, but it was going to come to an end soon. It wasn't going to last. And it's right here that everything changes, because from this point forward, most of what we know comes from Jesse himself, his confession, and the way his story was reported and retold in the newspapers. And as you've probably already noticed, not every version lines up perfectly. Some accounts say that one boy was awake. Others say both were asleep. Some even reverse the order of what happened. But after going through all of these reports over and over again, one version begins to stand out as the most consistent and honestly the most plausible. So this is the version that I'm going to share. By this point, it was roughly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and both boys had fallen asleep in the buggy. The long morning, the food, the steady motion of the ride, it had worn them out. Jesse later said that 3.5-year-old Omer was asleep at his feet, and 2.5-year-old Dee had fallen asleep on his arm. Dee still had a piece of banana clutched in his little hand, and Jesse lifted his little hand to his face and gave it a kiss. He said he could feel that Dee's face was cold, so he warmed it with his hand. And for a moment, everything was quiet. In the silence, he knew what he had to do. He loved those boys more than anything, and this was the only way to save them. Jesse climbed down from the buggy, holding little Dee in his arms. He was in such a deep sleep that he didn't wake up. Jesse carried him over to the grass near the edge of the road and laid him down gently beside a corner fence in the field. He then pulled the revolver from his pocket, and he shot him in the forehead. The sound shattered the silence, and that's what woke Omer. Omer stirred in the buggy, suddenly pulled out of sleep, confused and disoriented. Jesse turned back, lifted him up, and carried him to the same spot, and this time it wasn't as quiet. Omer looked at him, and this is one of those details that shows up again and again in the accounts, no matter which version is being told. This moment of recognition, that something wasn't right. He asked him, "Papa, what are you going to do?" And Jesse later said that he couldn't bear the look of fear on his little boy's face. He couldn't bear the way that Omer was looking at him. So after laying him down by the fence beside his baby brother, he placed his hand over the 3-year-old's eyes, not to comfort him, but because he didn't want to see that fear. Then he fired again directly in the forehead, and just like that, it was over. 2 little boys left lying in the grass along a quiet road, the buggy sitting nearby, the horse waiting, as if nothing had changed. And for a moment, there was nothing but silence. But that silence didn't last. Jesse realized that he was as good as dead, and he would rather be put to death by the law than by an angry mob. So he immediately got in the buggy and headed north to the city of Marion in Grant County. Not long after Jesse drove away, people began to pass along that same stretch of road. It was the middle of the day. Farmers were out, neighbors were moving between homes, and eventually, someone saw them. It was Mr. and Mrs. John Tigert, who owned a nearby farm. They spotted 2 small bodies lying in the grass near the fence line. It was shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
At first, they didn't even know who the children were. They weren't from around there after all. They just knew something was terribly wrong. The Tigerts didn't touch the bodies at first. Instead, hastily drove to the home of Farmer Wagman. He accompanied them back to the bodies. Farmer Wagman saw that this was no prank. He also seemed to notice what the Tigerts had not. One of the boys, the bigger of the 2, was clearly gone. The other was not. Dee was still alive. Barely. Wagman ran back to his house and called Dr. Haynes from Sims, asking him to come at once. Word spread quickly, and within minutes, neighbors began to gather. Someone was able to identify the boys as those who had been at the home of Mr. Robert Hall for the past 2 days. The boys were both lifted carefully and placed into a buggy, and they made their way as quickly as possible back toward the Hall home.
At that same time, others fanned out in different directions, some going for a doctor, others already beginning to ask the question that was on everyone's mind. Who did this? When the boys were brought back to the Hall house, Sarah wasn't there. Emma Kilgore was still home alone, and when she saw them, there was no question. These were her nephews. She had even called out to another neighbor who was passing by the farm, and that neighbor confirmed what Emma knew. There was no doubt these were the McClure boys, Omer and Dee. 3-year-old Omer was already gone. He had died from the wound before ever being brought back to the house. The doctor later said that he'd probably lived about 20 minutes after being shot. But little Dee was still alive, gravely injured, but alive. Someone had alerted Sarah, and she came back immediately. She was absolutely devastated, just heartbroken. There simply aren't words to describe what she likely felt in that moment. Sarah took Dee into her arms and held him, pressing him close, as if somehow she could keep him here just by refusing to let go. Witnesses later described the condition he was in ways that are difficult to hear and even harder to imagine. But despite everything, she stayed with him. She would not leave his side, not even for a moment. For days, she sat at Dee's bedside in the Hall home. She wouldn't even go into the room where Omer's body lay because she knew she wouldn't be able to handle it. She also wanted to be with Dee, were he to take a final breath. She was so determined to stay with her living son that she didn't even attend Omer's funeral 2 days later.
Outside the house, the atmosphere was changing because now people knew. They knew who the children were. They knew where they had come from, and they knew very well who had done it. And once that realization set in, anger followed. According to several newspaper accounts, men began to gather. Farmers, neighbors, people from the surrounding area, some arriving on foot, some with wagons, many carrying whatever weapons they had at hand, shotguns, revolvers, even stones and sticks. There was talk of forming a posse. They roamed over the countryside looking for this baby killer. Because they didn't want a trial. They wanted him.
But they were too late, because while all of this was happening, while neighbors were gathering, while word was spreading, while men were arming themselves and preparing to hunt him down, Jesse was already miles away.
Egosi! Egosi is the only crisp wheat that has been scientifically prepared. Only the choicest and soundest of the finest wheat that can be procured is used in its manufacture. All vessels and machinery used in its manufacture are carefully sterilized. It is crisp, healthful, and wonderfully palatable. Note, the price of Egosi is 10 cents for a full-size package, such as is usually sold for 15 cents. The largest food mill in the world with the most approved labor-saving machinery enables us to make the best flaked wheat food at this lower price. Ask your grocer for the green package. If your grocer does not keep it, send us his name and 10 cents, and we will send you a package prepaid. Egosi.
After leaving the boys along that quiet stretch of road, he didn't wander, he didn't hesitate, he drove with purpose, heading north toward Marion in Grant County. It was a distance of more than 20 miles, and he made the trip at neck-breaking speed. Jesse was absolutely terrified of being ripped to literal pieces by an angry mob, and he needed to turn himself in first so that the police could protect him. By the time people began organizing to search for him, he was already entering the city. He didn't go straight to the jail, as one would expect. He didn't rush in, breathless and frantic, to confess what he had done. Instead, he stopped at a livery stable on 40th Street, later identified as Smith's Livery Barn, and turned over the horse and buggy. The livery barn attendant noticed right away that the horse was covered with foam.
When the newspapers described the horse as being covered with foam, they weren't talking about foam at the mouth like you might picture. In horse terms, that actually refers to sweat. When a horse is driven hard, especially over a long distance, the sweat mixes with friction from the harness and forms a light, foamy lather on the horse's neck, chest, and sides. So what they're really telling us is that this horse had been pushed, hard and fast, for miles. It's a small detail, but it gives us a very clear picture of just how urgently Jesse made that trip to Marion.
The rig, which he had rented from Mr. Newkirk's livery stable in Elwood, was returned as if this were any other ordinary transaction. He asked that the horse be fed, and he made sure that everything was settled. And then he walked into town. He made his way to the club restaurant and sat down for a meal. And again, this is one of those moments that feels almost impossible to understand. Inside the restaurant, he took a seat and ordered a meal. He wasn't loud, he wasn't drawing attention to himself, but something about him stood out because, as he sat there eating, he was visibly upset. Tears slid down his face as he tried to compose himself, quietly going through the motions of any ordinary meal. At some point, someone working there noticed and asked what was wrong, and Jesse answered. He said that he had done something serious enough that he expected to hang for it. He didn't go into detail or offer an explanation. There was just that single, chilling statement. And then he continued eating. When he was finished, he stood up, left the restaurant, and made his way to the Grant County Jail. There, he asked to see the turnkey. The officer on duty, Charles Jones, came forward, and Jesse introduced himself by name, Thomas Jesse McClure. And then, without hesitation, he told them what he had done. His confession was recorded in the newspaper.
My name is Thomas Jesse McClure. I've just killed my 2 darling little children. I killed them because my wife had left me and refused to see me. My wife is living with the family of Robert Hall, 4 miles west and 1 mile south of Point Isabel, just on the inside of the Grant County line. I've been living at Frankton, Indiana, 4 miles south of Elwood. I called my wife at the Hall home at noon today. Her sister came to the door and said my wife would not see me. I then asked to see my 2 little children, aged 2 and 3 years, and named Dee and Omer. My wife's sister brought them out to me to the buggy that I had. I placed them in the buggy to take a short drive. I drove up and down in front of the Hall house several times and then stopped in front of the house and asked my wife to come out and talk. She sent word by her sister that she would never again see me. I told her sister that she would be sorry for that. I then decided to get revenge on her for she had been unfaithful to me. I drove back down the road and to the rear of a small clump of trees. My 2 little children were asleep in the buggy with me. When I stopped the buggy, the jar woke my little Dee. He looked up to me and said, "Papa, what are you going to do?" I put my hand over his eyes, took my gun from my pocket, and shot him in the forehead, killing him instantly. The shot awakened little Omer. I took him by the shoulder and fired a shot in his head. Both fell to the bottom of the buggy. I drove the horse to the side of the road and lifted both bodies out and neatly laid them out on the withered grass. I then drove directly to Marion and the jail, and am here to give myself up. The neighbors will lynch me when they find out what I have done. I don't care what you do with me. I'm ready to die and expect to hang for this crime. All that I ask is to see my dear little ones buried.
Now, you'll notice something here. In one version of the story, Jesse says that little Dee spoke to him. In another, it's Omer. And this is one of those moments where we have to step back and think about how these stories were actually recorded. Jesse gave his statement once that night in Marion, then again that night in Indianapolis, and then again in yet another jail the next day. But what we're reading are newspaper accounts of that statement, written later, sometimes from memory, sometimes paraphrased, and often rewritten before going to print. So it's very possible that the confusion here isn't coming from Jesse at all, but from the way that his words were reported. And when you look at the ages of the boys, it becomes a little clearer which version is more likely. Dee, at 2.5, would not have been able to articulate his thoughts that well, and from a developmental standpoint, I believe it was most likely that 3.5-year-old Omer is the one who made the statement.
One version says he woke up when the buggy stopped, and the other says he woke up when the shot was fired.
Right, and we just don't know. I personally think it's very likely that a 3-year-old would wake up from the sound of a gunshot going off at 10 feet away, because at least one of the boys was still unharmed when that first shot was fired. So I think it's very plausible that's what woke the other one up, and I think it was Omer because he was scared and asked what he was going to do. Once Jesse finished confessing, the room went quiet, because at first there was hesitation. What he had just said was so extreme, so far beyond anything ordinary, that the men listening didn't immediately know whether to believe him. People made false claims. People exaggerated. Was this guy crazy? Because this was almost too much to take at face value. But Jesse didn't waver. He gave them details, names, locations, directions, exactly where the children could be found, down to the stretch of road near the Hall home, just inside the Grant County line. And as he spoke, the doubt started to fade. Sheriff Mills from Marion was notified and he acted quickly. Telephone calls were placed to Elwood, to Point Isabel, to anyone who could verify whether there was any truth to what this man had just calmly confessed. And one by one, those calls came back, confirmed. There had been a shooting. 2 children found along the road, shot in their heads at close range, exactly as Jesse had described. Inside the jail, the atmosphere shifted immediately. This was no longer a question of whether the man was telling the truth, because obviously it was real. And outside, the situation was already beginning to spiral, because word was spreading fast. Faster than the authorities could fully control, and the sheriff understood something almost instantly. If the people out near Point Isabel had already begun forming a posse, it was only a matter of time before they turned their attention to Marion, before they came looking for him. And if they reached that jail, there wouldn't be a trial, there wouldn't be a sentence, there would be a lynching. So the decision was made, quickly and without hesitation. Jesse McClure could not stay in Marion.
Within a short time of his arrival, arrangements were already underway to move him out of the county entirely. Officers began preparing for transport, not as a routine procedure, but as an emergency measure. They weren't just holding a prisoner, they were holding a man that an entire community wanted dead, and they needed to move him before the crowd got there. And this sounds a lot like James H. Coyner. His case was in Mississippi, and he also had to be taken to a jail that was mob-proof.
You are correct. And listeners, if you have not listened to that episode yet, I highly encourage you to find it because it is so good. But okay, back to 1903. The clock was ticking. While the officers inside the jail were making plans, people outside were already starting to gather.
That was fast.
Yeah. Now, at first, it was just small groups, like curious onlookers, men who had heard something, rumors of a crime, whispers of children being shot, and they came to see for themselves what was happening at the jail. But it didn't stay small for long. The crowd began to grow, and as it grew, the mood began to change. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was outrage. Inside, Sheriff Mills and the officers knew exactly what they were dealing with. They had seen it before. It didn't take much, just the right kind of crime, the right kind of victim, and a crowd could turn into something else entirely. So they moved quickly. Instead of taking Jesse out the front, where people were already beginning to gather, they brought him out through the rear of the jail. There was no announcement, no spectacle, just a quiet, urgent effort to get him out before anyone realized what was happening. He was placed into a carriage and rushed toward the interurban line.
If you're not familiar with interurbans, these were electric trolley cars that ran between cities. Fast for their time, and incredibly useful for moving people quickly across distances without drawing too much attention.
And that's exactly what they needed. They boarded one of those cars and began the trip toward Indianapolis. The other regular people in that car didn't know. They were riding along like it was any other day, commuting, traveling, going about their business, completely unaware that just a few seats away was a man who had, only hours earlier, shot 2 babies in the head. Meanwhile, back in Point Isabel and the surrounding countryside, the situation was reaching a boiling point. Men had gathered with weapons, a posse had formed, they were searching the roads, the fields, the neighboring towns, looking for Jesse McClure, but he was already gone. By the time the full weight of what had happened reached them, by the time the anger turned into action, he was on that interurban car, heading for Indianapolis to a jail that was built to withstand exactly the kind of fury that was now building behind him.
Back in Grant County, people were still searching roads and fields, still trying to piece together what had happened. Jesse McClure was taken directly to the Marion County Jail, where Sheriff Metzger took charge of the situation.
Now, to avoid any confusion, the city of Marion, Indiana, is in Grant County, but the city of Indianapolis, Indiana, is in Marion County. So he is now in Indianapolis.
But even that transfer hadn't exactly followed the rules, because normally moving a prisoner like this from one county to another required official paperwork, documentation that clearly transferred custody, and in this case, there hadn't been time for any of that. This had been done very quickly. So, when Jesse arrived in Indianapolis, Sheriff Metzger didn't just take possession of him automatically. He had to call Governor Durbin to get permission, and it was granted. And that alone tells you how serious this was. But it didn't stop there. The governor also made another offer, one that makes it very clear what officials believe might happen next. He offered to send in state troops to protect the jail.
Yeah, and again, this is so much like the James H. Coiner case. They turned the city into a war zone, like literally, to protect James from lynching. So that's how real the fear of mob violence was in this case. Inside the jail, they weren't taking any chances either. Jesse wasn't placed in just any open cell. Sheriff Metzger had him put into what was considered the safest part of the building, a cell located in the very center of the jail. It wasn't along an outside wall, it wasn't near a window, it was surrounded on all sides by steel, actually separated from other cells. So, in other words, if a mob came, this was the hardest place to reach him. Because even here in Indianapolis, they understood exactly what they were dealing with. And once he was inside, people began to watch him very closely. Because now that the immediate danger had passed, now that he was no longer at risk of being dragged out by a crowd, the question began to shift. Not just what did he do, but why? Was he insane? Jesse didn't behave the way people expected. At times he was calm, able to speak clearly, recount events, answer questions without hesitation. I mean, he knew where he was and he knew what he had done. But then there were moments where he broke down completely, weeping uncontrollably and talking about his children in a way that didn't quite align with reality, saying that he had killed them because he loved them, because it was the only way to save them. He started off by saying,
God told me to do it. My wife was unworthy to care for my children, and a message from God told me that it was best to kill them.
To some, it sounded like madness. To others, it sounded like a man trying to explain away something he knew was unforgivable. And while all of that was being debated, while people were trying to decide whether Jesse McClure was insane, evil, or something in between, another issue quietly came into focus. Jurisdiction. Because when the sheriff, the prosecutor, and an officer from Grant County went out to the scene, when they stood there on that stretch of road looking at where the boys had been found, they realized something very important. The crime hadn't actually taken place in their county. This was Tipton County, and this was such a relief.
Not our problem.
Exactly. So responsibility shifted, authority shifted, and with it, Jesse himself would eventually be transferred again, this time into the custody of Tipton County officials, where the case would formally move forward. In fact, the sheriff from Tipton County showed up without any word, it was totally unexpected, in Indianapolis the next morning of October 26th and was like, he's my prisoner, it's my jurisdiction, I want him. And he didn't have the safest of jails, but he was like, I'm sure we'll be fine. So he just took him. He surprised the sheriff over in Indianapolis. But anyway, so it was the next day, October 26th, that he was transferred one final time to the Tipton County Jail. Once Jesse McClure was in Tipton County custody, things began to move very quickly. Formal charges were filed, witnesses began to be identified, statements were collected, Sarah's statement, Emma's statement, neighbors, doctors, and Jesse himself continued to talk. And the more people observed him, the more divided they became. On the surface, there was nothing confusing about what he had done. The facts were clear. The sequence of events was clear. He had planned it, he had carried it out, and then he turned himself in. But when it came to why, that's where things started to fracture. Was this a calculated act of revenge, or was this the behavior of a man who had lost his grip on reality? Doctors were called in to examine him. Lawyers began preparing arguments, and even before the trial officially began, the groundwork for an insanity defense was already being laid. As people tried to make sense of Jesse McClure, descriptions of him began to appear in the newspapers, and some of them were blunt.
McClure has the appearance of a man who was gifted with little brains at the outset, and while not by any means an idiot, he is not a man of much intellect.
So basically they're saying, he looks kind of dumb.
Yeah. They're like, he's not very bright. Yeah, pretty much. So while all of this was happening, while Jesse was being moved from jail to jail, while officials were figuring out jurisdiction, while people across the region were forming opinions about what kind of man he was, back at the Hall home, there was only one focus: little D. In those first few days, it didn't look hopeless. In fact, for a time, it looked like he might survive. He regained consciousness. He was eating a little, he was gaining strength, slowly, but enough that people began to hope. Enough that Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, somehow, he would pull through. And she never left him. She stayed at his bedside day and night. Like I said earlier, she refused to even go into the room where Omer's body had been laid, knowing that she wouldn't be able to bear it. And she didn't even attend his funeral. She stayed with Dee, watching him, holding him, and waiting. Doctors examined the wound, and they determined that, in a way, it was almost miraculous. The bullet had entered between his eyes and traveled upward, passing over the skull and exiting through the top of his scalp. It had actually not penetrated the brain. But the damage was still devastating. The impact had caused severe trauma and inflammation, swelling of the brain that his small body simply couldn't overcome. And while surgery might have been considered in another case, Dee was never physically strong enough to withstand it. So they waited and prayed and hoped for days. For nearly 2 weeks, he lingered, sometimes seeming stronger, sometimes slipping back, long enough for hope to take hold, and then slowly begin to fade. And then he finally took a turn for the worse, 16 days after being shot. On November 10th, 1903, little D died from his injuries. He was just 2.5 years old. And with his death, what had once been a desperate hope became final. Both boys were gone, and Jesse McClure was now a double murderer. And as the defense began laying the groundwork for an insanity plea, another detail started to emerge. In weeks and months leading up to the murders, Jesse had been reading about another case, the case of Alfred Knapp.
Alfred Andrew Knapp was born in Terre Haute, Indiana, sometime in 1863. He was the son of Cyrus and Susanna Knapp, and he had one sister, Sadie. At some point, he moved to Ohio, and in 1902, he strangled his second wife, Hannah, and proceeded to take her body to the Great Miami River and leave it there. After her disappearance, Alfred stayed for a number of days at his sister's house before he suddenly decided to search for Hannah. In early 1903, he met his next wife and married her a month later. The same month as their wedding, he was arrested on suspicion of murder. When he was returned to Hamilton, he started to confess to not only the murder of Hannah, but several other murders as well, starting in 1894.
Wow. So Jesse was a true crime fan. Just imagine that. Pretty interesting. I mean, me too, but I'm not going to strangle my husband. Anyway, so Jesse had been following that story very closely. Newspaper accounts indicated that he had read about Knapp's crimes, he had studied them, and had even discussed the case with others, including his wife, Sarah. He knew what had happened, he knew how it had been carried out, and he knew how it had been received.
Rain or snow-proof leather is ideal leather. The new leather which is always bright, glossy, strong and soft, and can't get hard. Rain or snow don't affect it. When you buy shoes, look for this label. Wolf Process Leather Co., Philadelphia.
When the trial finally began, it didn't take long to see just how much attention this case had drawn. The courtroom in Tipton County was packed. Some had come out of curiosity, some out of anger, and some because they simply could not understand how something like this could happen, and they wanted to see the man responsible with their own eyes. When Jesse McClure was brought into the courtroom, all eyes went to him. People leaned forward. They watched him closely, studying his face, his posture, the way he moved, looking for something that might explain it, something that might make sense of it. But again, what they saw didn't quite match what they expected. Someone who had murdered 2 little boys should be wild-eyed and, foaming at the mouth. But as people tried to make sense of Jesse McClure, more details about his past began to surface. One of his former teachers even spoke about him as a boy. This came out in the paper. He described Jesse as a difficult child, someone who really needed discipline, and in his words, he believed in the idea of spare the rod, spoil the child. So he said that when Jesse was 14, he had, quote, laid on the birch pretty thick. Because he didn't want to risk spoiling him. And according to the teacher, one of these beatings caused Jesse to become so angry that he built up such a fury that Jesse threatened to kill the teacher someday. And when that teacher later heard that Jesse had killed his 2 little boys, he said he was glad that Jesse was now in the hands of the law. And at this point, Jesse is about 43 years old, so it's been quite a long time, almost 30 years since that incident had happened. And that wasn't the only part of Jesse McClure's past that came up during the trial. This actually wasn't the first time he had been accused of trying to kill someone. Records showed that back in 1895, Jesse had been indicted in Grant County on a charge of attempted murder. At the time, he was working on the construction of the Market Street Bridge when he got into a fight with a contractor, his boss. And during that fight, Jesse struck him over the head with a crowbar. The injury was so severe that it nearly killed him. A grand jury indicted Jesse for attempted murder, and he was brought to trial, but the case didn't end in a conviction. The jury couldn't agree because there was apparently some evidence suggesting that it was possibly justified, so in the end it resulted in a hung jury, and Jesse walked away. To further understand him, they were also turning to medical opinions. Doctors had been brought in to examine him, to evaluate his mental state, and to determine whether there was any evidence that he was truly insane. And at least one of those doctors did not hold back. Dr. Newcomer said,
McClure is a degenerate of the most pronounced type.
In 1903, the word degenerate didn't just mean immoral or cruel. It was often used as a kind of pseudo-medical label, suggesting that a person was fundamentally flawed mentally and morally inferior, even a bit of a throwback in evolution and not as civilized or evolved as the rest of us. It didn't necessarily mean someone was insane. In other words, they were saying that Jesse was more animal than man.
Yeah, and this whole concept of degeneracy is part of what led into the eugenics movement in the USA. As for Jesse McClure, they said you could just see the criminal tendencies in his facial features. The papers even referred to him as, quote, the inhuman father. He was not considered to be on the same level as other humans. The first day of trial was Monday, November 23rd, 1903. That whole day and the first half of Tuesday were dedicated to seating a jury. In total, they had examined 181 men before they settled on 12. The afternoon of Tuesday, November 24th, is when the testimony began. First to testify was Charles Jones, the turnkey of the Marion City Jail, who Jesse first surrendered to. The prosecution began by laying out the facts of the case, the timeline, the movements, the witnesses who had seen Jesse that day. They didn't need to convince the jury that he had committed the act. That part was already established. It was not up for debate. The whole purpose of this trial was to determine what kind of sentence he would get. If he were found to be insane, then he would go to a hospital rather than a prison. The prosecution focused on the deliberate planning and execution of this crime. They pointed to the horse and buggy being rented the night before, the early morning departure, the food purchased for the boys, the repeated attempts to speak with Sarah, and the statement he made when she refused.
She will be sorry for that.
And they built their case around a single central idea, This was not madness, this was revenge. But the defense was preparing to tell a very different story. But before the defense could begin building that story, the prosecution called one of their most important witnesses. Because this case wasn't just about what happened on that road, it was about everything that led up to it. And no one understood that better than Sarah McClure. When she took the stand, the courtroom grew quiet. This was the woman at the center of it all, the wife who had left, the mother who had lost her 2 youngest children, and the person who had tried again and again to prevent exactly what had happened. And now she was going to tell them why. Sarah testified clearly and calmly, not in the emotional, frantic way that some might expect, but in a way that made it very difficult to ignore what she was saying. She began with her marriage. She told the jury about Jesse's drinking, about how his behavior changed when he was intoxicated, about the way arguments would escalate quickly and unpredictably, and how over time those arguments turned into something much more serious. She described a home that was not safe. And then she began to talk about the violence. She told the court about the times that he had beaten her, about the threats he made repeatedly that he would kill her, about the fear that had built over time until it became something she could no longer live with. And then she described what happened in early October of 1903. She told the jury that Jesse had turned his anger on her 5-year-old daughter, Veda, that he had begun beating her. And in that moment, Sarah stepped in. She put herself between him and her daughter, and that's when the violence turned fully on her. She testified that Jesse struck her with a washboard hard enough to break it over her head, splitting open her scalp. It was that incident, more than anything else, that made it clear to her that she could not stay. She had to leave. There had been another time when he injured her arm so badly that he fractured it. She told the jury that there were times when he was physically violent toward Veda and the boys as well, and how she would step in between them, knowing full well that doing so would only turn that violence back onto her. She made one thing very clear. She was afraid of him, not in a vague or passing way, but in a way that made her believe, truly believe, that he was capable of killing her. She explained how she had gone to the authorities, how she had filed the affidavit for assault and battery, how she had asked for a surety of the peace, begging the court to require Jesse to post a bond, just to put some kind of protection in place, and how she had gone back more than once, but they didn't listen to her. But Sarah knew that if he got out of jail, he would come for her, and this wasn't just her fear talking, because Jesse himself had already told law enforcement what his intention had been that day. He admitted that he had gone to the Hall home planning to kill Sarah, as well as the children, and himself. That was the plan. He said he couldn't just kill Sarah because then he would hang and the children would have no parents. He needed to kill the whole family. While listening to Sarah's story, everyone in the courtroom started to piece it together that everything that Sarah had feared would happen did happen. Just not in the way she expected. She believed that he would kill her. She believed that she and Veda were the ones in danger. She had never imagined, not even for a moment, that he would kill his own boys.
The trial moved quickly after that. Arguments were made, evidence was summarized, and the case was placed in the hands of the jury. They deliberated overnight with 3 jurors, initially thinking he was insane rather than guilty. But after 11 hours, Jesse McClure was found guilty of murder in the 1st degree, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He was sent to the Michigan City Penitentiary in Indiana on December 2nd. He wound up dying of tuberculosis in 1907. And while the trial brought a legal end to Jesse McClure's story, Sarah's life continued. On May 26, 1904, just months after the trial, Sarah filed for divorce, and she didn't wait long to begin again. By July 5th, 1904, just days after that divorce was finalized, Sarah married Lafayette Gordon.
Which seems to be a pattern. She goes straight from one divorce to another marriage, so that's interesting. But yeah, life moved forward. Sarah and her husband actually had 3 children together, but it was not an easy road. In 1906, while living just east of Windfall, one of her young children, 2-year-old Raymond, got hold of a bottle of carbolic acid while Sarah was cleaning. He drank it, and in the chaos of her trying to pull it away, the acid wound up spilling, burning his face, chest, and hands, and it was very severe. But Raymond survived thanks to Dr. V.S. Chance. And as the years went on, we can see a decline take place in Sarah. In 1911, that same child, Raymond, he was about 5, he was attacked by a group of hogs while running through a field. The animals knocked him to the ground. They were trampling him into the mud and biting him in the head, shoulders, arms, and torso. So, of course, he's screaming, and the screams got the attention of his father and a neighbor whose farm they were on. And the father and the neighbor came running over and literally had to fight the hogs off with pitchforks. Like, this was crazy. And little Raymond, they saved him, thank goodness, but he's cut everywhere from these bites, and he was bleeding profusely. And Sarah, by this time, this is wild, she did not believe in doctors anymore, probably because they hadn't been able to save her kids, I don't know. But she didn't believe in doctors, and so it was actually neighbors who had to call for doctors to come and take care of him because they were worried about blood poisoning. Now, by 1913, her behavior was drawing attention in another way. There was a revival service because, that holiness movement had been moving across the United States. So she's at this revival service, and there was a song, like she was in the choir, a song was being sung, but then suddenly she just started shouting. She wasn't singing anymore. She's just like yelling. And so the reverend went over and was like, hey, quiet down. Like, she had just joined like 3 weeks prior. And so they're like, lady, like, I know I don't know you very well, but I'm going to have to ask you to be quiet. And as they were trying to get her to be quiet, she started yelling louder and louder and was screaming. And so the reverend actually asked someone in the church to escort her out, but Veda was there, and Veda got her to go with her. And so that was crazy. And that wound up in the paper. That's how I know about it. And it turns out that similar things had happened at other churches prior to this. That's probably why she had to join this one 3 weeks prior. But yeah, over the next several years, that path kind of continued. By 1919, Sarah was actively participating in holiness religious movements, traveling to Kokomo, Indiana, taking part in services, and even helping to lead street meetings. So she was not just attending, now she was part of it. So Jesse's life ended quietly and quickly after the trial, but Sarah's went on for decades. She raised her family, she endured hardship, she continued down a path that at times set her apart from those around her. And in 1938, her life came to an end, and the cause was listed simply as paralysis.
And Veda lived until 1982.
Yes, and I did find her on Find a Grave. But yeah, she had married someone with the last name Biddle, then someone with the last name Sharp, and then Heidelman, I think, was the third one.
Many marriages like her mother.
Yeah. Huh.
Well, shout out to Find a Grave and Ancestry.com and FamilySearch.com and Newspapers.com and my brother.
Yes. And Pixabay.
And follow our socials. Forgotten Felonies on Facebook and Forgotten_Felonies on Instagram and Threads. Send us an email at forgottenfelonies@gmail.com or click the link and send us fan mail. And don't forget to leave us a review.
Oh, you know what? There's a new feature in Buzzsprout where when people send you fan mail, you can actually respond.
Oh.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yep. So that's pretty cool.
Look at us. We did it in an hour and a half.
Yeah. Crazy. The only thing that slowed us down was the traffic.
This episode was brought to you by traffic.
We good? Perfect. Woo woo. I like it. I like it all. Well, best of luck with the rest of it. Have a great rest of your day. I am gonna go on a little hikey hike, I think. Sunny. We'll talk to you later. Have a good one. Bye now.